Memorial culture is obviously flourishing today, especially in directions attuned to heated emotional issues and contemporary political and social concerns. Now, that's not to say that so-called traditional memorials are not also being commissioned, such as the National World War II Memorial, designed by Friedrich St. Florian and dedicated on the National Mall in Washington in 2004, or, more recently, the George W. Bush Presidential Center, which was designed by Robert Stern and dedicated just last month on the campus of SMU, Southern Methodist University, in Dallas. But numerous memorials dedicated to subjects such as slavery, terrorism, religious persecution, natural disasters, and disease have also materialized in various public landscapes. Maya Lin's Civil Rights Memorial, which we see here, includes specific references to the many activists who were murdered in this country's long struggle for racial justice. So in my talk this morning, I'd like to situate these particular memorials in revisionist understandings of history, including ethical imperatives to remember those who have been forgotten or marginalized, a strong emphasis on linking or connecting the past with the present, and heightened expectations of emotionally engaged forms of public art and architecture. I'd especially like to consider how these often termed victim memorials can act as sites of social and political conscience. Consider, for example, the Clayton Jackson McGee Memorial, designed by Carla Stetson, dedicated in Duluth in 2003. Located downtown, a few blocks from Lake Superior, the memorial recalls the June 1920 murders of 3 African-American men employed with the John Robinson Circus, which had stopped in Duluth for a single day of performances. Falsely accused of sexually assaulting a local white woman, the men were arrested and incarcerated in Duluth's jail, right in the heart of the city's business district. That night, the jail was attacked by a mob of some 10,000 people, and this was about 1/10 of the city's population at the time, who overpowered the police, grabbed the prisoners from their cells, and then lynched them from the crook of an electric light pole, and that's the light pole that we see on the left. Built directly across the street from the site of the lynching. So this photograph is actually taken at the site of that electric light pole. Duluth's memorial is a small courtyard plaza with a curving sidewalk and beige-colored walls with the words of Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., and others written in quotations. The walls are bordered with a quote from 18th century British philosopher and statesman Edmund Burke, which reads, "An event has happened upon which it is difficult to speak and impossible to remain silent." The sidewalks are embedded with the words respect, compassion, and atonement. The memorial's main iconographic element is on the far right. 3 life-size bronze figures dedicated to the 3 young men who were murdered in Duluth. Elias Clayton, age 19, Elmer Jackson, age 22, and Isaac McGee, age 20. And this memorial is really the first in the United States dedicated to lynching, which the NAACP declared in November 1920 as, quote, the greatest shame in the United States. Growing numbers of victim memorials have been built in recent decades, memorials to those harmed by political, social, religious, economic, and cultural injustices, and also to those who suffer the tragedies and ravages of nature or circumstance. Memorials to victims of terrorism, racial discrimination and violence, school shootings, massacres, of natural disasters such as earthquakes, fires, and hurricanes, of countless tragedies and traumas, increasingly occupy specially designated and designed spaces and places around the world. They represent part of a larger commemorative movement I call Memorial Mania. A pervasive preoccupation with issues of memory and history, accompanied by urgent desires to express or to claim those concerns in visibly public context. Those that focus on shameful historical moments, such as racial terrorism and the history of slavery, and that's what this memorial project at the University of North Carolina is all about, raise questions then about how to remember, represent, and perhaps redeem those histories in particular states. Interestingly, the United States National Park Service has taken a leadership role in developing spaces and places that commemorate some of these particularly shameful histories. Sites of shame, the Park Service declared in 1994, should be included in the park system to present a complete picture of our history. In 2002, the Park Service began reckoning with the remains of the President's House in Philadelphia, where George Washington and John Adams and at least 9 African slaves that they owned while each was president lived from 1790 to 1800. Located just 50 yards from Independence Hall, the house's former slave quarters are just 5 feet from the entrance to the recently redesigned Liberty Bell Center, where the nation's premier icon of freedom is on public display. Although the President's House itself was demolished in the 1830s, the Park Service launched an archaeological dig at the site and committed several $1 million towards its commemoration. Dedicated in 2010, the memorial consists of low walls that roughly frame the footprint of the original brick house, rectangular slabs with mock fireplaces and video screens, and an interpretive program of images, text, and sound recordings centering on freedom and slavery in making the new nation. It will give us an opportunity to talk about the heroic and shameful that took place at this site, observes the superintendent of Independence Hall National Historic Park, who adds, "We the people applies to everyone who was part of the making of this nation." And this is a pretty good slide of some of the sort of participatory elements. Now, I understand that some of the tech breaks down rather frequently, and there are lots of things we could talk about in terms of ideal conditions of the site, but I think it's an interesting project in terms of the recovery of memory, and particularly shameful American histories. Today's Memorial Mania is driven by heated debates over self-definition, national purpose, and the politics of representation, by adamant assertions of citizen rights by diverse publics, and persistent demands for representation and respect in the public sphere. These issues are not entirely new, of course. There were plenty of conversations about appropriate subjects, styles, text, and intentions during the post-Civil War statue mania era, when patriotic lobbies and nostalgic constituencies erected many memorials to certain historical subjects, like Providence's Pilgrim Monument, dedicated in 1910 to the landfall of the Mayflower Pilgrims in 1620 in what is now Providence, Massachusetts. However, the memorials made a century or more ago were not meant to revive old struggles and debates, writes Kirk Savage, an art historian who's written quite a bit about memorials, but to put them to rest, to show how great men and their great deeds had made the nation better and stronger. Commemoration then was a process of condensing the moral lessons of history and fixing them in place for all time. Whoops. Memorial Mania, by contrast, is less convinced of a seamless or shared narrative, and is far less engaged in notions of a triumphant national history. Rejecting a collective or consensual ideological framework, many of today's memorials are marked by conflict, rupture, and loss, by interest among artists and audiences alike, in revisionist and often unsettling accounts of history. Many, like the memorials in Duluth and in Philadelphia, are expressly commissioned to address especially difficult, complex, and shameful historical subjects. Ours is an age of heightened anxiety, perhaps, about memory, about history. After decades of postmodern critique, widespread recognition of the fundamentally constructed nature of knowledge has led us to reject fixed, official, and perhaps consensual understandings of historical causes and events. Yet we have not rejected history. We are consumed of thoughts about what is historical, who is historically significant, and importantly, how do we go about remembering? Today, our grasp of history is largely inseparable from our fascination with history, or our fascination with memory, rather. An obsession, writes Andreas Huyssen, that relates to the following. First, acts of memory are charged with the formation and the reformation of personal, social, and national modes of identity. Second, our insights about memory are inherently presentist. As Maurice Halbwachs once observed, even at the moment of reproducing the past, our imagination remains under the influence of the present. And third, acts of remembering are predicated by fears about forgetting, about not properly accounting for the nuances of history, about accusations of cultural amnesia, and I think tied to this, worries about how we will be forgotten. Much of today's memory work is driven by ethical imperatives to remember those who have been forgotten or ignored in history. Their inclusion as historical subjects often then upsets traditional or accepted historical narratives by acknowledging new narratives of difference, oppression, struggle, and resistance. Their representation, such as in Nance's memorial to the abolition of slavery, is rooted in present-day social and political concerns about rights and respect. Today's memorials are further contextualized by today's cultural turn toward public feeling, part of a larger experiential turn regarding ideas about history, memory, and identity. That is, many contemporary memorials are informed by understandings of felt experience. As Maya Lin observes, I don't make objects, I make places. I think it is very important that places set a stage for experience and for understanding experience. Today's heightened emphasis on victim commemoration originates in the recovery and remembrance of the Holocaust. In the 1980s, Holocaust memorials began to gain intensified public and political presence around the world. Today, there are over 3,000 such memorials in Germany alone, and as many as 1,200 in Poland. Other Holocaust memorials have been built at considerable distance from the camps and countries where the genocide of Jews, Gypsies, queers, Catholics, and others took place. In the United States, for example, there are hundreds of different Holocaust memorials, museums, and monuments located in cities including Atlanta, San Francisco, Boston, Baltimore, Milwaukee, New York, San Antonio, Terre Haute, Indiana, Washington, D.C., etc. Growing attention to the victims of Nazi persecution has prompted the making of other memorials to other victims at other historical moments. In Buenos Aires, for example, the monument to the victims of state terrorism was dedicated in 2007 in remembrance to those who were murdered during Argentina's political dictatorship of 1976 to 1983. And the concrete walls are permanent. Many of the displays, such as those that we see on the bottom, are temporary, lasting for sometimes years and sometimes only months. And In Moscow, the memorial to the victims of the Gulag was erected in 1990, dedicated to the millions of Russians who were imprisoned in forced labor camps during the Stalinist era. And this is sort of an interesting memorial. The big rock that we see there is from one of the gulags, and it replaced a displaced large bronze statue of a Stalinist leader, actually the head of the KGB. In Washington, D.C., the Victims of Communism Memorial was dedicated in 2007. This is located just a few blocks from Union Station. In Madrid, a memorial to the 192 victims of a terrorist attack on a Notre train station, this was in March of 2004, was dedicated in 2007. In Dublin, a memorial to the victims of the Great Famine, 1845 to 1849, was erected in 1997 on the city's Custom House Quay. In Manhattan, a similar monument called the Irish Hunger Memorial was dedicated in 2002. This is a pretty extraordinary space featuring an interior, a wraparound, and an elevated space, and you can see exactly what sort of real estate it occupies right there before the entrance to Battery Park. In Nanjing, a huge memorial complex dedicated to the estimated 300,000 Chinese victims of atrocities committed by the occupying armies of Japan in 1937. First opened in 1985, it's been revised and redeveloped twice in 1995 and again in 2007. And in Canberra, and I'm just picking select examples to sort of give you a sense of global dimensions of these memorials and also the difference in styles and spaces. In Canberra, the capital of Australia, a memorial was built in 2007 to the 353 people who drowned during the sinking of SIEV-X, a dilapidated fishing boat crowded with refugees from Iraq and Afghanistan seeking asylum in Australia. I'm not sure if you remember this story. Most of the asylum seekers whom the government refused to rescue were women and children hoping to join male family members who were already in Australia on temporary protection visas, highly punitive documents that actually prohibited family reunions. Memorials to the victims of plane crashes and to natural disasters are also omnipresent. This memorial was dedicated in 2012 in Clarence, New York, to the 49 people who died in 2009 when their regional airplane crashed due to pilot error. And here we see some of the number of memorials that have been erected in Thailand to the 2004 tsunami and the estimated 230,000 people who died. And every year, everywhere, we see temporary memorials to the thousands of people who are victims of car accidents in this country, and we see these along highways as well in South America, Latin America, and Europe. Among victim memorials, slavery memorials are especially growing in number. In Europe and in England, such memorials have been dedicated in Amsterdam, Bristol, Lancaster, and Liverpool. Here are some examples of the memorial in Lancaster. In Africa, these have been built in Cape Town, Zanzibar, Senegal. In the Caribbean, they can be seen in Kingston, Martinique, and also in Matanzas, Cuba. And in the United States, they have been erected in Savannah, Richmond, Chapel Hill, we saw the piece earlier, and here at the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center, where just last year a commemorative marker acknowledging the African American slave labor that helped build the nation's Capitol building in Washington in the 19th century was dedicated. Next year, and unfortunately I don't have designs for this, Brown University plans to unveil its much delayed, I suppose, slavery memorial commissioned from artist Martin Puryear. And also the United Nations hopes to unveil a $4.5 million memorial addressing the transatlantic slave trade, and this will be erected at its headquarters in New York. As the chair of the UN Memorial Committee told reporters, "It is right that we should have this monument. It will right a wrong, which is that the international community has never before acknowledged this tragedy, and we think that the monument should be a tangible manifestation of what the UN and the UN Charter stand for." Not too long ago, it was history's winners, its warriors, generals, and presidents, who were the primary commemorative subjects of both national and local public culture. But today's memorials increasingly focus on history's victims. Importantly, memorialized victims are not cast as losers in some sort of simple or static binary that contrasts them with history's winners. Rather, many victim memorials define history on new terms as an active and activist project charged with bearing witness and righting wrongs. Victim memorials often recover histories that are traumatic and deeply troubling, especially in states that imagine themselves in terms of idealized concepts such as freedom, justice, and democracy. Not surprisingly, these can be highly fraught projects. At their best, victim memorials point the way to social and civic engagement and to social and political transformation. At their worst, they ignore the reasons for their existence, or they valorize victims as heroes. In La Gloria, Mexico, for example, the Niños Zero, or Little Boy Zero Memorial, is dedicated to the first known victim, 5-year-old Edgar Hernandez, of H1N1, the deadly swine flu that erupted in 2009. The child who lived, and we see him here on the right, is depicted clutching a toad in one hand, a reference to the second of 10 deadly plagues that were inflicted on ancient Egypt, as recounted in the Bible. Although estimates suggest that more than 500,000, 500,000 people, died from the global swine flu pandemic during 2009 to 2010, the bronze memorial erected in La Gloria's town square symbolizes this young boy's victory over his and their own victimization, which is implied as an act of God. While it recognizes La Gloria as the epicenter, or ground zero, of this influenza outbreak, it also frames this small Mexican town, which is about 120 miles from Mexico City, as a triumphant survivor. The circumstances of how and why the swine flu actually originated in La Gloria, which is located just a few miles from a gigantic Smithfield Foods slaughterhouse and pork processing factory with a horrific record of environmental violations, including vast lagoons of untreated manure and the contamination of local groundwater, were completely overlooked. Instead, the statue's sculptor says that this piece portrays a child who was cured and who represents the union of all Mexicans. He adds, "Never before have so many people come to this community for a fair or a concert, and if more people come to La Gloria because of the statue, I will be the proudest man on earth." And it's interesting. Victim memorials are, in fact, among today's most popular tourist destinations. In 2006, the Nanjing Massacre Memorial received over 2 million visitors. In 2010, 1.4 million people visited the death camps at Auschwitz-Birkenau. In 2011, an estimated 40,000 people visited, and this is foreign visitors, visited Rwanda's Genocide Memorial in Kigali, one of several the country has built in remembrance of the 1 million Tutsis and Hutus who were murdered during the 1994 Civil War. The House of Slaves on Gorée Island in Senegal, where thousands of Africans were imprisoned before being shipped to the Americas, receives 200,000 visitors a year, many of them African Americans making pilgrimages to their ancestral homes. Likewise, Eastern European concentration camps, such as those at Auschwitz-Birkenau and Treblinka, are visited each year by thousands of American and Israeli Jews participating in what is called roots, or heritage tourism. In the United States, memorials to the victims of terrorism see thousands of visitors each year. More than 600,000 people visit the Oklahoma City National Memorial each year, commemorating the 168 people who died because of Timothy McVeigh's murderous act of domestic terrorism in 1995. Since opening in September 2011, more than 5 million people have visited New York's 9/11 Memorial. And in 2012 alone, 300,000 people visited the Flight 93 National Memorial, which is located in a remote field near Shanksville. Has anybody visited this particular memorial? Where one of the planes hijacked by terrorists on September 11 crashed, killing everyone on board. I had the opportunity to visit on December 31 of this past year. So my slide on the top left gives you the conditions that it can be experienced in high winter. And surprisingly, there were at least 50, 75 people coming in on New Year's Eve day. And I talked to a park ranger, and she told me that there had just been busloads of people coming in earlier that morning. For some tourists, the appeal of victim memorials lies in their grim authenticity, in their seeming proof of real-life ruin and tragedy. Many of these memorials are located directly at the sites where the horrible deaths and disasters that they commemorate took place. The two huge pools that constitute New York's 9/11 Memorial, for example, occupy the footprints of the Twin Towers that once stood there. Likewise, the two huge gates that are positioned at either side of Oklahoma City's memorial frame both the actual physical location where McVeigh's victims were murdered and the moment of the bomb blast that killed them, 9:02 a.m. on April 19, 1995. The memorial's east gate is etched with the time 9:01. The west gate reads 9:03, meaning that the memorial recreates and tourists re-experience the temporal and spatial dislocations rendered by McVeigh's act of terrorism. Except they don't, of course, and they can't. However captivated we are by the horrible crimes and deaths that these sites represent, our privileged feelings are those of grief and gratitude, with sorrow that so many died, and with thanks that we are not among them. Victim memorials remind us of our own fortunate existence. Victim memorial tourism, part of a larger industry, sometimes called tragic tourism or dark tourism, is encouraged by various tourism and public art initiatives. Over the past decade, for example, Norway's National Tourism Routes program has spent up to $400 million and commissioned several hundred artists and architects design bridges, kiosks, shelters, pathways, scenic overlooks, and memorials along 18 different highways spanning the country's 15,000-mile coastline, all part of a national economic incentive to draw tourists to remote, impoverished, and typically undervisited and depopulated parts of the country. And here are just a few of the examples. Some of them are truly incredible. Vardø, a former fishing village situated on a treeless island in Norway's Arctic Northeast, a craggy coastal output close to Finland, Russia, and Sweden, features one of the most haunting of these new tourist destinations, the Stilneset Memorial for the victims of the Finnmark witch trials. Designed by Peter Zumthor and featuring an installation by Louise Bourgeois, this was a posthumous project as she died in 2010. The memorial pays tribute to 91 people executed for sorcery in Vardø between 1601 and 1692. The hysterical persecution of witches was hardly confined to this northeastern region of Norway, of course, but was rife all over late medieval Europe and Great Britain, and then spread to colonial American settlements such as Salem, Massachusetts. Persecution in Vardo, however, was extensive and unforgiving. Of 135 people accused of practicing witchcraft in the region, 2/3 were executed. Vardo's victims, 77 women and 14 men, many of them indigenous Sami people, were tried, tortured, and burnt at the stake at Stalneset. The memorial dedicated to them is located on the site where they were killed, within view of the small town's Lutheran church and its graveyard and its former fish warehouses. Today, Vardo's fishing industry is almost completely defunct, taken over by offshore trawlers that ship fish directly to processing plants in China. Today, the town relies on state subsidies and tourism. An annual snowball tournament attracts many. We see this on the bottom right, and I'm not kidding. People come literally from all over the world to participate in a international snowball fight. The island's bird sanctuaries are also highly recognized. Last summer, and you can see where this is on the map on the left. Vardo is way up there on the far right. Last summer, Vardo hosted Komafest, an artist-organized project focused on northern Norway's general depopulation issues. Street artists, including Colin Harrington, Steve Powers, and Vils, were invited to paint murals on buildings throughout the village. One of them, painted by the French street artist Remede on the side of a former seafront warehouse, and this is on the bottom left, included the text Heliga Hex Fortuna, or Holy Witch. Vardo's memorial to the victims of its 17th century witch trials consists of two buildings, Memorial Hall and Glass Pavilion, both designed by Zumthorpe. The first is a very long, 125-meter horizontal structure elevated off the rocky ground, accessible by ramps, and inspired by traditional wooden racks. We can see some here on the top right, that were once used to dry fish in the region. Inside the timber scaffolding is a pale gray container made out of heavy sailcloth, shaped like the carcass of a fish, and speckled with 91 small windows and 91 naked light bulbs suspended from electric cables. Zumthorpe explains that after visiting Vardo in 2007 and seeing lamps in the windows of the few houses still inhabited in the village, he came up with the idea of devoting a window to each of the victims that looks out onto the landscape and lights up at night. Next to each window are black silk panels inscribed with historical information on each of the victims of Vardo's witch hunt. Taken from the original court records of the witch trials, the text include the charges brought against the victims, the evidence, their pleas, and their sentences. These particular details of accusation, torture, confession, and manner of death are actually plentiful. Like modern bureaucrats, post-Reformation zealots took careful notes on those they surveilled and eventually condemned as social and political threats. The regional state archives in Tromsø, Norway, is packed with their court transcriptions, legal documents, logbooks, and files. Maintained for centuries, records like these have only recently caught the attention of scholars and publics increasingly attuned to history's shameful chapters, to the aberrations of justice and the sinister workings of state power, religious intolerance, popular prejudice. The memorial's second building, a smaller, box-like space framed with Corten steel columns and smoked glass panels, houses bourgeois' installation, which is titled The Damned, The Possessed, and The Beloved. A metal chair is centered inside the glass box, contained within a sloping cone of cement, and shooting flames from the gas jets projected in its seat. Placed above the burning chair is a circle of 7 oval-shaped mirrors, each reflecting the eerie, contorted shapes cast by the flames below. Open to the elements, the glass panels stop just short of the ceiling and include gaps to allow for drafts of wind. The glass pavilion is often buffeted by snow. And in the background, you can see how close this is to the coast. Despite the persistence of perpetual fire, Bourgeois' installation is somber and disturbing. The reflections in the mirrors evoke the tortured, writhing bodies of Vardo's victims burning at the stake. The single chair alludes to falsely accused individuals targeted by maniacal, vindictive groups. It bears witness to a wretched episode in human history, writes one critic. It bears witness in reenacting the repressed crimes that happened in Vardo. Bourgeois' installation, coupled with Zumthor's understated architecture, is a compelling plea for empathy with people destroyed by the fires of collective madness. These comments, I think, address the transformative potential of this and other victim memorials. Originally commissioned to attract tourists to northeastern Norway, the Style-Neset Memorial to the victims of the Finnmark witch trials has helped put this remote rural outpost of Vardo on the cultural destination map. Zumthor's design has been widely praised. In 2011, Architectural Digest called it one of the 10 most significant memorials of the modern era. Here we see it almost completely taken over by snow, and it actually is closed from November through March or so, as is most of Vardo. Its significance lies both in its compelling aesthetic form and its historical content, its recovery of the region's shameful history of persecution and violence. But beyond historical reclamation, the memorial sets the stage for the formation of contemporary historical consciousness. As Norway's Queen Sonja remarked at the dedication ceremonies for the memorial in June of 2011, Style-Neset is a symbol of the intolerance of the period, but can also serve to remind us of the prejudices, injustices, and persecution that exist today. In fact, despite its small size, Vardo employs more than a dozen lawyers who work for the State Compensation Office dealing with victims of violent crime. High unemployment and poverty are related to escalating incidents of domestic violence in the region. Cultural projects like the Style-Neset Victim Memorial and the murals painted during Komafest aim at countering historical amnesia about awful events in Vardo's past and the seeming bleakness of its economically depressed present with new narratives of human rights and hope. During Komafest, for example, artists and locals joined together in a collective town cleanup, clearing rubbish from abandoned lots and even restoring a 100-year-old movie theater that had been closed for decades. Vardo is also pursuing new state-sponsored energy initiatives. The meaning that victim memorials have for today's audiences, their abilities to link the past with the present, to evoke responses of personal responsibility and social obligation, and to be sites of conscience, rest especially on their affective and emotional dimensions. As Zumthor observes, my main aim is to make emotional spaces, to create not just a beautiful space, but a space that touches me, that has emotional impact. As a boy, when I saw memorials of generals on horses, I thought they were so boring. I tried to do everything possible here, not to have a general on a horse, but an emotional space that brings you as close as possible to the historical dimensions. The affect generated at Style-Neset's Victim Memorial is that of shame, the shameful failure of a society to behave on just and humane terms. By recovering this shame, Vardo, and by extension Norway, admit their abrogation of justice and resolve to right historical wrongs by perhaps seeking a more ethical present. As sites of conscience, victim memorials affirm and build civic voice and critical democratic engagement. Linking memory and history on emotionally engaged terms, such memorials suggest the transformative possibilities of commemorative landscapes. Thank you.
come and sit
Sure.
here, maybe? I'll give it a go. And we can... Brian, could you put the lights on, please? Thank you. Well, thank you. It gives us a chance for comments or questions. Open the floor at the moment. Anyone? Okay.
One thing that comes up over and over again, and we brought this up in the presentation, is that the way we interpret history is in flux, and that interpretation is not set. But yet, memorials, by their very nature, tend to set those meanings and values in an unchangeable fashion. I don't know if you have any speculation on it. How do you address the permanence of a memorial with society's changing interpretations of what it's memorializing?
That's a good question. Well, I'm not sure about the permanence of memorials. I actually think that it'll be interesting to see how long this stands. The weather, the conditions, these are brutal. And already the piece has been closed. It's closed right now. I know people who wanted to go see it this month, and it's closed for another couple of weeks for repairs. So purposeful permanence, or it's simply going to fall apart. These are things we have to think about. And of course, a lot of memorial makers are making temporary or memorials for particular periods of time, and then that's it. So that's one possible answer to what.
The general trend is that more temporary memorials that's increasing versus permanent. Okay.
Yeah. But I also think that the trick is, if you're going to have a permanent memorial, to recognize that the content and to a degree the form, the memorial that you're making, has to be responsive to exactly the dilemma of the non-fixed history or story that you're telling. And there are different circumstances here. There are fixed numbers of people that die, but there are open-ended understandings of what that means then, now, and into the future. So it's complicated, but I think that the idea of creating a memorial that is one-dimensional, monolithic, has only one or two possibilities in terms of narrative and understanding for the public. I think that's increasingly gone. I think that memorial designers are increasingly attracted to more of the complications and nuances of history and to narrative. Yes?
You mentioned the George W. Bush presidential library.
Just because I was being mean.
You weren't mean enough.
But I'd like to give you an opportunity to be mean. Presidential libraries seem to have a more overt, deliberate intention to create a narrative, a specific narrative. A close colleague of mine wrote his dissertation on presidential libraries, and if he were here, I'd ask him this question too.
Is that Ben Huffbauer?
No, it's Patrick Boyd.
Okay, all right.
2006, something like that. But my main sources are Jon Stewart, ridiculing, so not authoritative, it's in the context of comedy, ridiculing the game scenario, the scenario play of, I don't know if you've looked at this, but you go into the George W. Bush Memorial and you're presented with a series of scenarios that he faced as president.
Yep.
And you have the choice of seeking the advice of these key advisors, and then you make your decision. And then there, in Jon Stewart's reporting, the voice of George W. Bush comes on and says, wrong, here's the right choice, and it's the choice he made. So, but I've heard other people contest that reportage, who've seen it themselves, and I don't know if you have.
I haven't been to the space. I've only seen it on
or
the Daily
special
Show.
comment on how presidential libraries sit in this spectrum of journalism of the history of the winners versus the open-ended narrative.
Right. I mean, and that's why I sort of included in what we might call traditional. I don't want to divide it up into those kinds of easy binaries, but the fact of the matter is the nuances of the George W. Bush presidency are probably not being observed in that traditional presidential library space, which is all about, as most presidential libraries in the post-World War II period have been, about sort of the valorization and validation of that particular presidency. I mean, I really can't think of a single presidential library where there are any nuances at all, with the possible exception of the Truman Library. But that's so far back in time that nobody wants to remember. Absolutely. I mean, I would add that that's also what's going on at the National World War II Memorial. I don't find that a particularly historically nuanced or complicated space, primarily because of what it leaves out and the sweeping kind of historical claim that it lays about that and about America.
There's a big difference between memorial and legacy. And
Yes.
we'll come back to that, I suspect.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I think we need to add to this conversation, which is, one of the sort of revelations of the experience for me of working on the 9/11 Museum, is the power of public expectation. And, that the public is not a blank slate. They do not come to places like this with no expectations. And the absence of narrative or the complications of narrative are not always not just what the public wants, but they're not helpful to the public in terms of explaining what's what. At a certain point, it becomes a need that even retrospectively Memorial will catch up with. For example, the Vietnam Memorial is now adding an interpretive center, which will explore some of the materials left behind and some of the soldiers who are fallen. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin added the information center below ground, which in my mind is one of the most successful Holocaust institutions in the world.
Stop, you're going to ruin my presentation.
In 8,000 square feet. The other thing is just the weight of this expectation is magnified almost geometrically by the numbers of people. That's the other thing. If you think about global events, why people are coming, I'll also talk about this a bit more in my talk. But people are coming because they've been taught to come to these places. That, our education systems, we have a meeting like this, our education systems, since children are very young, in the last 30, 40, 50 years, have taught them that they are supposed to participate in these kinds of events. So my experience with them is there's not a passive encounter on the part of the visitor. They have expectations. If the expectations aren't met, they want more than they get. At the memorial, we have many expectations we're not meeting for more explanation of 9/11, which we hope to meet when the museum opens, but 7.5 million people have come, and those expectations, to one degree or another, haven't been completely met. So it's a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah, and I think that it would be almost impossible to meet all those expectations. And there too is a difference between the memorial and the museum, although they mesh. They're so intersected these days. But there are increasing possibilities with memorials, which have always existed at museums, for layering of meanings and for sort of adding to reactions such as, oh, I didn't expect that was something different than what I came here for, which is what would hope for almost any cultural engagement.
Thank you very much, Erika. I learned a lot from your presentation. One thing that struck me is that were this a memorial without text, you really wouldn't know what you were looking at.
True.
And so, and of course, it's also without figures. So here you have this question of, you have something completely abstract, and yet there has to be a ready explanation. So separate from the memorials that are, just textless. In fact, what we have in the victim memorial, somewhere along the line, there has to be text, which is the exact opposite of the man on the horse. Because it doesn't really matter. Once I was in, I think, Xinjiang or somewhere, Urumqi, right, and there was a figure standing like this. Everybody said, oh, it's Mao, but actually it's Julius Caesar. So there you go. And because we have, expectant figures as memorial figures, heroic memorials.
Right.
And so in this other turn of memorializing, the forgotten, you actually, and Maya Lin is actually one of the first to just name the name. And so you have a very interesting problem of what is the nature of abstraction, what is the nature of text, and then also why, in the end, the text stops being read. You know, at Penn Station in Philadelphia on 30th Street, there is a huge memorial to the First World War participants from the Pennsy Railroad. Does anybody look at the names? I mean, they have no meaning.
Right. What I like about this, what attracts me is, I recognize that the long 125-meter piece may not be around very long. The little glass box pavilion, though, might last longer, and then it would be devoid of text. But there's something eerie. There's something going on in that space if the jets keep going that I'm not sure it even has to be about, because when you go in the space, you're going to say something evil happened here. How do we reckon with evil? So, I mean, I think there are ways to get past the necessity of text. I mean, it sounds very futuristic, but I think that this project could work without the panels on the left.
I don't think so. I
don't
really
know.
don't. I think that, and also here you have an activation of an archive. I mean, after all, somebody had to scratch around. I mean, these are 17th century archives.
Yep.
It's not an accident.
No.
So the project begins in a very different location. What you were saying is, okay, it's because, you know, they wanted to actually bring cultural tourism to Norway. But I think it is also this question of the, you know, the invention of tradition school that has been now active, you know, for a good long time. And because it is, and it has to do with essentially that tension between the archival, you know, archive tape makers and somehow trying to bring up the archive in some tangible way. And that's always a problem. You know, Cathars were persecuted in southern France. The only thing we now have left are archives of the Inquisition, right? There will be a memorial. If you're, I mean, your projection is that now all of these recovered archival groups of victims sooner or later will be memorialized. Well, you just collected a very nice, you know, series. And then children will be, you know, taken through, and they will be taught a different kind of narrative of history. Still, it's a made-up narrative, one way or another, in the end. So I'm not sure. It's interesting as a kind of a spiral. This problem of remembering and forgetting, and what it is that, you know, and then why do we even have things like the idea that you bring out individuals as models of behavior? You know, the great men or the great women series. This is just the opposite. And so how do we actually look at history, even from that point of view, from a larger ethical framework? But these are sort of other questions to listen.
Yes.
Go ahead, sir.
Renata's just reminded me of something in this question of remembering or forgetting, particularly with reference to victim memorials. And what I'm recalling is an essay in the Boston paper within a day or two after the bombing at the Marathon, arguing that the writer hoped there wouldn't be any memorial to this event on that site, that we should put this behind us and not let it sully that space. And I wonder, is there controversy about victim memorial? Does that ever surface? And I mean, what we have now in Boston
absolutely,
is a
and
makeshift
I'm sure we'll be
memorial
talking about that more. I think following the, well, we all know the response following 9/11. Following the bombing in London in 2005, there was a very different response, which is, let's not do what they did in the United States. Let's have a different sort of approach, which was, you tried terrorism, but we remain stalwart. We're not going to invade, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that. And I think that, in a sense, is what's driving the response in Boston. I'm sure there will be a memorial of some sort, but what they were cautioning was, let's spend some time, let's be patient about this, let's not necessarily do it right at the site. I thought it was, I know what you're talking about with the editorial. I thought it was a very interesting response. And I think a lot of it comes out over the last 13 years of response to the 9/11 memorial. And they're very quick. I don't know if you'll recall, but the evening of 9/11 on the television, they were already talking about what kind of memorial would be made. I was shocked that the words memorial were coming out of the mouths of broadcasters. So, yes.
I'm glad you went first because my question was about that. Specifically, this phenomena of sort of instantaneous memorials, people leaving flowers or sneakers in Boston, et cetera, and what role that plays in an ultimate physical memorial potentially, and what your thoughts are on those sort of is that a memorial in a way? Is that instantaneous outpouring right after an event? Think back to Diana, Princess Diana, billions of flowers, etc.
Or at the World Trade Center, or
Right.
at Columbine, or absolutely, those are memorials. People talk about them as temporary memorials, or populist or grassroots memorials. They have a big impact in terms of what eventually gets made. Sometimes there's great contestation over keeping some of the temporary memorial with the permanent memorial, which is something that they did at Oklahoma City, and they chose not to do at the Flight 93 Memorial. They were, and then they didn't. At the, correct me if I'm wrong, but at the September 11 Memorial in New York, they don't collect and preserve items. There's no encouragement to leave items. I mean, this creates a nightmare of cataloging and collection, and conservation issues. But it has become very widespread practice, not just in this country but elsewhere. I mean, talk about expectations.
I should just correct that because much is left at the memorial. It's all collected and evaluated. The organic materials are discarded.
And the other things.
The other things are kept.
Is your museum then being responsible? You're taking responsibility.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Two comments. Thanks, Erika. This was very interesting, to hear you again and see the work, the kind of evolution, and the kind of thinking process about sort of moving towards the desire for the ethical, let's say, that comes, clearly in your presentation. I'd like to ask a couple of questions, if you care to reflect on two ideas that we talked about before, but I think are significant, which connects to this leaving stuff, let's say, places. Can you expand a little bit on the idea of mourning in public? You wrote eloquently about it. Can you tell us a bit more about this notion that people leave stuff and people go to these places not only to find history or to read history, but there's a specific question of our society, our cultures, and in relation to the idea of the mourning in public. That'll be one issue. The second one is the question of a word that disturbs me tremendously, and I don't know how. I've been working on this subject for some time. It's not disturbs me, but it's a question that I ask myself every time we do a project, and it's the word metaphor. How do we address the question of metaphor as generative, of a project or of a thinking process, and the idea that people have to understand, or that metaphor needs to be explained so that the memorial or whatever space makes sense, if in any way, But the mourning is this thing that culturally I'm interested in more.
Yeah. Well, I have written about this and talked about it, and we've all seen this in our country, and we think it's fairly contemporary, but it actually goes back a ways, that the immediate impulse upon being confronted by something tragic and horrific, such as the shootings in Connecticut, is to visit the site, and if you can't visit the site, provide something. Now, it used to be the provision would be money or possibly blood donation, but increasingly people are sending. So teddy bears, but all sorts of other things. I read this fascinating account how in Connecticut they were receiving boxes and boxes of things that people had in their garages, in their attics, that they might have sent to Goodwill, and they were packaging up and just sending it, as if people in Connecticut needed the stuff that would have ended up going to Goodwill. So, I mean, on the one hand, it's, because what? They need stuff from Goodwill. On the other hand, it's this psychological impulse particularly in an age that is about materialism and material consumption and the soothing of objects and materiality. So I think this is all connected. I also think there's a code of behavior when, let's say, a teenager is killed in a car accident and these roadside memorials go up. You visit these spaces, but you don't go empty-handed. You go with the flowers, the teddy bear, the item. It's sort of become a behavioral or mannered habit in our culture. And it's not just us, it's happening elsewhere. And a lot of that has to do with how easy it is to do and how inexpensive it is to bring these items, which are considered acceptable items at the site of mourning. So it's almost as if we don't trust our own affect, physical, psychological response. We have to live anchored in a thing. And so that thing is brought to the site. And it's no surprise then from the thing that the memorial might be created, that there's a thingness or materiality associated with public mourning. And I don't know what to say about metaphors. So I will leave that. Yes?
I just want to, again, thank you for the talking. Some buildings were new, some memorials were not. But I guess something that's always kind of bugged me in visiting certain memorials is the memorial that's out of sight or out of place. It's an isolated memorial, such as you have Holocaust memorials that are in America, and sometimes they're disconnected. But in other times you have memorials that are part of the larger procedural or processional experience of that site. For instance, the Auschwitz-Birkenau. That's become extremely touristic, and so much so that I visited there, and there's literally, they sell ice cream, on the grounds, which is kind of disturbing in a whole other sense. But at the same time, the memorial is that, I don't know if it's like the, kind of the wrap around or whatever, the bag to keep things in, or if it's just a fact to kind of bring something new to the experience. But it's interesting to see, how memorials are taken by this. If you walk through these sites that are already memorials in themselves from time, and then you I don't know if people feel the need to build something upon them. I mean, this is a good example of forming public in general the good of this, but some of the greater, Oklahoma City Memorial, a lot of people knew it was there, and it's a case of just keeping that in the minds of people. But there's other sites where if you go out west, you have these huge monuments which are kind of not really memorials, but in a sense they are, because it's memorializing with the ideas of whether it be Mount Rushmore, which in a sense is a memorial, but it's to strictly touristic and just to say these important figures in United States history. But the idea that the memorial, I guess what I'm trying to say is, have you found a very interesting or very strict policy on some people that will approach memorials? They say we only do this if it's in the site versus this can be done outside of the site, because it's very interesting, to me, and I guess maybe to other people, just how do you approach the difference, and do you take a memorial on that's really out of the site? What does that kind of do to your psyche? Basically, I guess to say is like, how much more do you have to believe once you're out of the site versus just taking the natural, your self-emotions from that site?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Well, I think that the Holocaust memorials that are built at sites that are not about the Holocaust are a way of making those sites about the Holocaust, because they're really about the people making those projects, not about the sites per se, right? So it's taking the space and making it general, and calling attention to people who might visit that space about, don't forget what happened over there. And then, back to what I was talking about here, reconfiguring responses to other Holocausts or other moments or other tragedies and traumas in the present. In terms of Mount Rushmore, it's a great example. How much affect do we have when we go to Mount Rushmore? My affective response is, well, we certainly blew up a lot of mountain to make these four faces, and that's sort of the response. Look how powerful we are in terms of being able to blow up a mountain. And then you can go 10 miles away and go see the Crazy Horse Memorial, and it's even bigger, right? Isn't it something like you can get Mount Rushmore in the nostril of one of the horse, not whatever. For me, this isn't anything except gigantism, and mastery of mountains and that type of thing. But that's important too when we think about the United States and memorial making and machines and men.
Can I add just one quick thing to the question about the sites and non-sites, let's say? There is always this dilemma, when you're always working with kind of, call it surveyed environments. And even in sites where things happen, one of the risks is to confuse debris of history for history itself.
Mm-hmm.
James Young wrote eloquently about this. I think that would be an important question, because the evocative power, lies in the visitor that establishes that kind of affective connection to a place. The place itself, can be confused by that. You see, ruins that have been preserved or whatever they are, but if there's no someone that goes there, that place, what is the meaning of the place? If there's no, the meaning is constructed, and that's to me an interesting dilemma. Sorry.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the public perceives memorials when they visit the site. I think that there's the fact that memorials are built, especially in the case of victim memorials, they're built for the victim and honoring victims. But I think that there's also kind of this knee-jerk reaction for the public to soothe their sense of shame, and also, or to pat themselves on the back that they did not take part in why this memorial came to be. So it's just interesting the psychological response to visitors, whether their first response is to honor, or whether their first response is to be more about being themselves and their relationship to the event.
I'm not sure they're inseparable either.
Yeah, that's true.
James Young talks about how memorials are essentially impossible. Because what they do is they set up closure, and closure is not what we should be about ever after, and yet that's what they do. So we can feel good about, well, we did bad, but we built this memorial, and if there are ethical aspects to it, maybe it can not be repeated. But that's very rare, because there aren't a lot of ethical aspects to so many memorials. But back to what Renata was saying, it is part of our civic upbringing in this country and elsewhere to visit memorials in order to understand what it is to be a citizen of a particular nation state. And what's interesting about victim memorials, and I'm not even sure I like that term, is the way in which they readjust or reimagine American and other nation state histories for us to be part of that. And I see the possibility there in terms of ethical and political transformation, but they could very easily go the other way, which is simply built a memorial, done with that, okay, here we go. And that's a problem.
Erika, I must say, I've never thought about it the way you have put it together so completely in a way that I didn't lose one point about it, but it starts making me think about what we as a design profession should do when we design anything that's going to be private or public space related to what is to be brought forward. And it's interesting because if I take a look at the George Bush Museum and I see it as a contributor to the environment, wow. I mean, it's a disgrace. And
I wasn't sure which way you were going.
Yeah.
I wasn't sure which way you were going.
But what happens here, in fact, when you made me start thinking that when we design certain buildings, there's certain things that the group or the owner or whatever wants to make some contribution about something. And I'm going to just go through a very simple example of something that was astounding to me. And it's like a memorial. And it's in the process of sort of naming a building or something. And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go to a project the Aga Khan did, which was the athletic facilities.
Who pointed me?
No, I'm pointing that they were ever. No, but okay. But it's very interesting to me. Hassan, I think you're aware of this one. He built, for the medical school, hospital, the medical school, the hospital, nursing school, that portion of the university. He built athletic facilities. And they started thinking about, what should they do or what should they say? And they did an astounding thing, and that was they wanted to be bring their group of followers sort of together. But what they really wanted to do, they wanted to bring the young people in their group of followers. And so the program was one in which they put out a fundraising program that was, I think, any person of a certain, any young person, I forgot what the age limit was, but something up to 22, 24 years old, could give $5,000, $500 only, $500 only. And it had some very young people, and it had some other people, but the families probably got behind it and brought it about. And we created a wall that very nicely just gave the names of all the people who contributed this, and it's a very substantial wall. And it gives, and it's glazed over, and it just gives their name, and it is lit at night very nicely, and it creates a wall where people sit and gather, etc. All I can say is those young people, when they get to be 50 years old and they go there and visit or see, I think there's more money coming. But it's also a very nice way of doing something to a side of a building. There's all kinds of things we're asked to put, and it's a problem. Naming buildings or naming, something for some donor, etc. It goes on in every university, on and on and on. In a way, it's just something about history. And yes, eventually, it dies in the distance. But I must say, my eyes were opened by you, so.
I hope that's a good thing.
It is a good point. My eyes always have to be opened every morning. Oh.
I think the naming thing is problematic on so many levels. We see the names everywhere. And in a way, this is what I mean by the assertion of citizen rights. I want my name on, and if I do it this way, this is how I can get my name on. But what about doing something that would be more constructive or more productive for the university? I don't know, scholarships for deserving students.
But they have names too.
They have names too, but they're actually activist in terms of the thing that drives the university. But that would be defeating the wall. So.
I'd like to go back to this business of metaphor.
It's all yours.
As you were all talking, I recall my escapades into literary theory and in fact into Arabic literary theory, and it has a very interesting theory of metaphor. That is, it has something that it describes as a simile, so in English it would be like. It has the metaphor, this as, and then it has a conception that I've always thought actually could even be applicable here, which is the distance metaphor, which is called isti'ara. Now that means that you have to be in the know, like inside here, to really get it. Now, if you apply this whole theory, and of course it arose out of groups of courtiers that exchanged poetry. So obviously, if I knew you very well, I could, just by a certain allusion, call on an entire other world of imagery through one word or phrase. So in terms of a lot of these memorials, in fact, we are not in the like world, nor are we in the as world. We are actually in this distance world because it requires a live social context. And the minute that is not rehearsed again and again, it dies. So this brings me to archaeology. And I'll talk about this later, but it's very interesting how this entire imaginaire is very rich, but it has to be constantly re-rehearsed through an entire societal participation. And absent that, or if that is ruptured, then, you know, you literally are left with a relic. I mean, really relics of the, of some transaction and not the thing itself.
Can I ask you a question which is to do with narrative again? So, has the narrative in memorials, in a particular memorial that you know of, changed completely? The text changed, the 20 years on or 40 years on, we now have a new interpretation, sort of like revisionist history.
Yes.
Are there good examples of that?
Yeah, I think what's happening at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is a good example of a revisionist narrative, particularly once the museum gets built, because from what I can ascertain, the intentions of their museum are to counter certain narrative responses to the wall itself. And it's interesting what history will go into the museum and what history won't be in the museum. And as you pointed out, history, text and story will have a big impact then on how people respond or think they should respond to the walking of the wall itself. I mean, as you'll know, I mean, most of us have been to the wall, I'm assuming. It's a very straightforward sort of memorial. You walk into the V and you walk out of the V. Maya Lin talks about how you walk into the darkness and then you walk out into the light. And it doesn't matter whether you walk towards the Washington Monument or the other direction, that you walk in and you walk out. And then, you know, she said that I wanted to make people cry. I didn't want to talk about the war. I wanted to talk about the loss of 58,000 lives. I think that the text and the narrative of the museum will change that, and we can talk further. But I've already seen, and perhaps you have as well, changes in how people understand the memorial today, which has been claimed by certain veterans groups as sort of a symbol of them and their right-wing political consciousness and right-wing political views. There was some protest planned at the wall in 2004 against the impending Iraq war, and there became a little melee there where there was a defense of the wall by members of Rolling Thunder and other groups who were angry that other people were coming in to destroy their wall, as they put it. And accusations flew on websites about vandalism of the wall. None of this ever occurred, but there was a fight that occurred between protesters against this war and veterans of the Vietnam War right at the memorial.
It seems that the memorials need explanation. And it seems that, I would have thought the Vietnam one would be powerful enough in itself.
Right.
Or maybe even this one, you didn't need it. Looks at, nobody read it. So,
well,
Can I
Marita
ask a favor?
Sturkin has written about this. I mean, when you create a blank slate.
Can I ask a big favor? A protocolian favor? Can we come back to this after I present?
All right,
because
sure.
I have
You've got
I
some
have a lot
thoughts
to
on it.
say
All
about
right,
this,
let's come back to
and
that.
I think that that our two perspectives will make for a very good examination of a
Okay,
360
sounds good.
view of this question.
Absolutely.
Sure.
We'll come back to it. I mean, this conversation will continue. If there's any last questions that are based on Erika's talk, especially that you want to bring up now, otherwise I think we can break.
Live to 260.
I guess we're going to break.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I guess we're going to meet back here in about an hour's time.